Hi class, let's get started with our discussion in human biology on tissues and the kinds of tissues and how we categorize those kinds of tissues within the human body. So first we need to define what a tissue is. Generally speaking, a tissue is made of two or more different kinds of cells working together for a common purpose or a similar function. And there are four broad categories of tissues we're going to talk about in this presentation. They are connective, muscular, nervous, and epithelial. And then we'll give examples of each and talk about the defining characteristics of each of these four broad categories of tissues. So first, class, concept check. Is a tissue living or non-living? You could say A, it's living because it's made of cells, which are alive, or B, non-living. Cells are the simplest unit of life, not tissues. So this is a question that's really hearkening back to chapter 3 and chapter 2 of your material. So you really can't rewind this presentation to find the answer, but you can check your notes and check previous PowerPoints or your textbook to get an answer. So pause this video and get me an answer. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. The correct answer is living. And our tissues are living because they're made up of cells, which are alive. Yes, cells are the simplest unit of life, but it's worth emphasizing that cells are not the most complex unit of life. The simplest thing that can be alive is the cell, but you and I as human beings are much more complicated than a single cell. And clearly, if you're watching this video and hearing my voice, you can be alive. You can put yourself in the living category. So let's dive in and first talk about connective tissues. Connective tissue is kind of the smorgasbord category. I personally find connective tissues to be the most exciting category of tissues because there's the most variety. Now, if we think of connective tissues, a general trend of connective tissues is that they bind and support the parts of the body together. We can use connective tissues to make lots and lots of ground substance and protein fibers that are in our tissues. This ground substance and protein fiber can be grouped together to be called the matrix of the tissues, oftentimes referred to as the extracellular matrix of the tissue. This extracellular matrix or tissue matrix is outside of the cells and holds the cells together. And these fibers will bind the cells together, and the ground substance is the liquid in between the fibers that are outside of our cells. And there are three kinds of connective tissue. We have connective tissues that are mostly fibers, we have supportive connective tissues, and then we have fluid connective tissues. That's right, we have liquid tissues in our body at room temperature. So here we can see there's a breakdown of the broad categories with the fibrous, the supportive, and the connectives. Our fibrous include our loose fibrous, our dense fibrous. For our supportive, we have cartilage and bone. And then for our fluid tissues, we have blood and lymphatic fluids. So let's dive in and talk about our fibrous connective tissues. We have both dense and loose fibrous, and then we could subcategorize those with the regular and irregular fiber arrangements. But the general trend is that these tissue types contain a fibroblast. Blast is a suffix that means to build. What does this cell type build? It builds fibers. The fibroblast cells make collagen and elastic fibers within the extracellular matrix. Now, our loose fibrous tissues are going to be found supporting the epithelial tissues and supporting our internal organs. You can think of loose fibrous as a supportive tissue type. Adipose tissue is categorized as loose fibrous, but it's really more of a miscellaneous category. Adipose tissue is where we store our body fat or our adipocytes. And because we don't have a very good category to put adipose tissue in, we put it in this miscellaneous connective tissue category. Let's look at some generic loose fibrous connective tissue. If we look at our loose fibrous connective tissue, you notice that there's a lot of white space. This white space, here's the actual light micrograph. This white space in the loose fibrous connective tissue represents liquid in the tissue, the liquid portion of the tissue outside of the cell. That liquid portion is known as ground substance. We also have fibers in our loose connective tissues. Those fibers are represented by these long strands that are going in many different directions. We can have collagen fibers, we can have elastin fibers, and there's some other fibers as well, reticular fibers, which are not, actually they are shown in this slide. How about that? We could also have blood vessels. Those are those large red tubes. Those are blood capillaries. So we have lots of white ground substance, and then we have lots of fibrous fibers, and the ground substance and the fibers combine to make the extracellular matrix. In purple, we can see here is a fibroblast. This fibroblast makes the fibers. And you can see these purple dots. Those represent the nuclei of the fibroblasts in this photomicrograph of loose areolar connective tissue, or just loose fibrous connective tissue. We also have supportive connective tissues, cartilage and bone. These supportive connective tissues are going to have empty chambers called lacunae. And these chambers can be filled with the cells that support them. So these hollow spaces in the cell or the tissues are called lacunae. There are lacunae in cartilage tissue and lacunae in skeletal tissue or bone tissue as well. A key characteristic of supportive connective tissues is the extracellular matrix is solid at room temperature. Cartilage is a solid tissue at room temperature, but it's still flexible. Bone is solid at room temperature, but it's still flexible. Not as flexible as cartilage, though, I might want to add. There are three kinds of cartilage we should emphasize. Those are hyaline, elastic, and fibrocartilage. Hyaline cartilage is very common in our body. It has very, very, very fine collagen fibers that are difficult to see in a light microscope. We find hyaline cartilage on the ends of our bones. This hyaline cartilage at the end of our bones reduces friction. We also have hyaline cartilage in our noses, and the skeleton of an unborn child or a fetus is made of hyaline cartilage. We also have elastic cartilage. Elastic cartilage has more elastic fibers in it than any other cartilage type. As its name implies, elastic cartilage is very stretchy cartilage. We have lots of elastic cartilage in our ears or outer ears, which makes them so flexible and able to spring back after being stretched. And then finally, our third type is fibrocartilage. You can think of fibrocartilage as the shock absorbers of our body. So the discs in between our vertebrae, our intervertebral discs, are going to be made of fibrocartilage, and fibrocartilage is used to make our pubic symphysis and used to make our menisci in our knees. Fibrocartilage is the least flexible of all cartilage types. We also have supportive connective tissues, these that can be made of bone. Bone tissues are also going to have those hollow chambers known as lacunae. The matrix of bone is solid and is much more rigid. It still has a little bit of flexibility from the collagen fibers, but it doesn't have much. You, generally speaking, don't want to bend your bone tissue too much, because if you do, you'll break your bone. The stiffness in our bone tissues comes from the calcium salts that are present, or more specifically, calcium phosphate salts that are present within our bone tissue. There are two main types of bone tissue in our bodies, compact and spongy. An old school term for spongy that you'll still see in some textbooks is cancellenius. But generally speaking, most people are moving towards the term spongy because it's very descriptive. Spongy bone looks like a sponge. It has an open lattice work of irregular spaces, aka it looks like a sponge. We typically find spongy bones inside the ends of our long bones. So I'll emphasize again, spongy bone is inside the ends of our long bones. Compact bone forms the outer surface of every bone in our body. The outer surface of every bone in our body is made of compact bone, including the outer shaft of the long bones of our bodies. Our compact bone does not have those irregular spaces in it that the spongy bone has. Instead, compact bone is very solid, as its name implies, and it has many repeating units in it known as an osteon. This osteon is a series of concentric circles that looks like a tree rings or a bullseye, and there's some little spaces in it for the blood vessels and for the living cells. Those little spaces for the living cells are called lacunae. So here's some cartilage. This is hyaline cartilage that's present at the end of the knee, or the bones of the knees. Particularly, this is hyaline cartilage that is on the proximal surface of the tibia. And this hyaline cartilage is mostly extracellular matrix with some little spaces, some lacunae, for the cells of the cartilage to sit inside of. And because I don't have a compact bone tissue figure, I need to go quick show you some compact bone histology. Compact bone histology. Here we go. Oh, that's an excellent, lovely, lovely photo right there. So here in compact bone, you can see there's these little black spaces. Those little black spaces represent the lacunae that have the bone cells sitting in them. And then we have these series of concentric rings. Let's go with This is a nice photo right here. I love this photo. Lovely, lovely. These concentric rings all combine to form the osteon, which is that functional unit of the compact bone tissue. Let's go back to our presentation. Here we go. Let's talk about our liquidy connective tissues. Our liquid connective tissue is blood, and blood has an extracellular matrix that has almost no fibers in it. The extracellular matrix of blood is almost exclusively liquid ground substance, and since it lacks fibers and is all liquid ground substance, or almost exclusively liquid ground substance, I should say, we have a special name for the extracellular matrix in blood. We call it plasma, sometimes referred to as blood plasma. Now, if we look at blood, there are three kinds of cells in the blood. These cells are called the formed elements. So there's three kinds of cells, three kinds of formed elements within blood. We have red blood cells, white blood cells, and platelets. Our red blood cells are technically referred to as a erythrocyte, cyte meaning cell, erythro meaning red. Our white blood cells are leukocytes, again cyte meaning cell, leuko meaning white, and our platelets are referred to as thrombocytes, cyte meaning cell, thromb. I'm actually not sure what that prefix means. I should look that up for you. Our red blood cells are going to be used to carry or transport oxygen throughout our body. White blood cells will fight infections in our body, and platelets are parts of cells that have broken off into our bloodstream and are used to clot blood. In this figure, we can see there's red blood cells, which are, as their name implies, red. Red blood cells are rather small and have, here we go, have a biconcave shape to them, so they look like little donuts, so to speak. Our white blood cells have a lot more variety. There's multiple kinds of white blood cells that have some with speckles, some without speckles, some with multiple nuclei, some with just one nuclei in them. And then we have platelets. The platelets are tiny fragments of cells that are smaller than the red blood cells. So if you're looking at a figure with some blood on it, the red blood cells will be your frame of reference. If the cell is larger than a red blood cell, it's a white blood cell. If it's smaller, it must be a platelet. The next fluid connective tissue type is lymphatic fluid. Lymphatic fluid's extracellular matrix is called lymph, and there's lots of white blood cells within the lymph nodes of our lymphatic fluids, or lymphatic tissue. Most people consider lymphatic fluid kind of an afterthought. Typically, most of our liquid tissues, most of the focus on liquid tissues is going to be focused in our blood, but it is still worth emphasizing that lymphatic fluid is of tissue as well. So, concept check class. Blank connective tissues contain large number of fibers. Is it fibrous, supportive, or fluid? Go ahead and rewind the video to get me an answer, or you can check your notes or your textbook. 5, 4, 3, 2, 1. The correct answer is A, fibrous. Fibrous connective tissues contain, as their name implies, large numbers of fibers. Continuing on, let's move on to muscular tissue. Muscular tissue allows us to move our bodies. A key characteristic of muscular tissue is it is the only tissue type that can contract in our bodies. Our muscular tissue has many muscle fibers, aka muscle cells. So when you see this term muscle fiber, that's a synonym for muscle cell. So a muscle fiber is the same thing as a muscle cell. These muscle fibers are going to have some protein fibers inside of them, known as actin and myosin. Actin fibers and myosin fibers are inside of our muscle cells. There are three kinds of muscle tissue in our bodies: skeletal, smooth, and cardiac muscular tissue. Our skeletal muscular tissue attaches to the skeleton. It is going to attach directly to a bone. That is a defining characteristic of skeletal muscular tissue. It must attach to our bones. Our skeletal muscular tissue has very long cells. The cells of our skeleton, or of our skeletal muscular tissue, can be greater than 10 centimeters long in length, so quite long compared to most of the cell types of our body. Another defining characteristic of our skeletal muscular tissue is that the cells are multinucleate. It has multiple nuclei in them. Here we see 1, 2 nuclei within this one section of a skeletal muscular cell. Another key characteristic of our skeletal muscle cells, or skeletal muscular fibers, is that they have stripes, or they are striated. They have these red and white stripes, or striations, in their appearance. Another key characteristic that we should emphasize is that you choose when to contract your skeletal muscle tissue. They are voluntary. You decide when to lift your arm up, when to move your leg, when to turn your head. It's a choice, a conscious choice. There's one notable exception, and that is the diaphragm, and that is a skeletal muscle tissue that will go on to will automatically inhale and exhale for you. We also have smooth muscle tissue. Smooth muscle tissue lines the hollow organs and blood vessels of our bodies. Our smooth muscular tissue is made of cells that start at a pointy end, get thick in the middle, and end at a pointy end. The technical term is fusiform. These cells have one nuclei per cell as opposed to being multinucleate like the skeletal muscle cell. Our smooth muscle tissue does not have striations. It's very bland in appearance. And, as you may have guessed, since it's the muscular tissue of our digestive tract and our blood vessels, this tissue is involuntary. We do not control when we contract or relax our smooth muscular tissues. We also have cardiac muscular tissue. Cardiac muscular tissue is going to be the muscular tissue of the heart. And this muscular tissue of the heart is striated, and it also has some very dark regions in it as well. Those extra dark lines are called intercalated discs, and those intercalated discs within the cardiac muscular tissue have a lot of gap junctions that allow for the cytoplasm of one cell to be directly connected to the cytoplasm of an adjacent cell. The cardiac muscle tissue is inherently involuntary. You do not control when your heart contracts or relaxes. That's on autopilot for us, thankfully. So, concept check, class. What characteristics separate muscle tissue, or the characteristic separates that separates muscle tissue from the other main tissue types is that what? Muscle tissue can what? Contract, conduct electrical impulses, has nucleated cells, or does not form organs. You can go ahead and rewind the video, check your notes, or check the PowerPoint slides to get me an answer. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. The correct answer is A. Muscular tissue can contract. That is the defining characteristic of our muscular tissues. And because they can contract, muscular tissues allow for movement of our bodies. Let's continue on with our next tissue type, that is nervous tissue. Nervous tissue is used to communicate between our cells, and we use it particularly for very fast communication between cells. So we'll take sensory information in, process that information in our brain and spinal cord, and then make a decision to move some muscular tissue based on how we process that information. There are two main kinds of cells in our nervous tissue. There are the neurons, which send and receive the electrical signals, and then there's the neuroglia, sometimes referred to as just the glial cells. The neurons are the most exciting cell types, and then there's multiple glial cells. There are many kinds of neuroglial cells. A neuroglial cell will function to support our neurons. If we look at a generic neuron is going to have a cell body, sometimes referred to as a neurosoma, and then there's going to be dendrites that carry information towards the cell body of the neuron, and a long axon that carries information away from the cell body. Those neuroglia are the support cells that help to support the neuron. Typically, our neuroglial cells are going to outnumber our neurons 9-to-1, or depending on some other sources you look at, they may even be as high as 10-to-1 outnumbering our neurons. Some neuroglial cells shown on this slide include an astrocyte, an oligodendrocyte, a microglial cell, and well, this is a Schwann cell shown right here, but they didn't label it a Schwann cell. There are other kinds of neuroglia that are not shown on this figure. If you want to learn more about them, you can take A&P and learn about them in more detail. So, concept check, class. A concept that separates nervous tissue from other main tissue types is that it processes information, conducts electrical impulses, has trinucleated cells, or is present in both the arms and the legs. So this is a tough one. I did not do a very good job of making this question easy for you. This is a synthesis question, and I haven't asked many synthesis questions yet. So take some time to think about it and get me an answer. Pause the video if you need to. 5, 4, 3, 2, 1. The correct answer is A, processes information. We can do that integration of information or processing information with our nervous tissue. Muscular tissue can send electrical signals that the muscular tissue uses to contract. There are no trinucleated cells within our nervous tissue, and we have many other tissue types, connective, muscular, and epithelial tissue types in the arms and legs. So that's not going to be unique to just nervous tissue types. The correct answer is A, processes information. Let's continue on with epithelial tissues. Epithelial tissues are made of cells that are bound very tightly together to form a continuous network. These epithelial cells are going to line the surface of our body and line body cavities and cover our organs and be found in all of our glands. Epithelial tissues are generally going to be connected to the underlying tissue types with a basement membrane. This basement membrane is not made of cells directly, but is made of fibers that are secreted by cells on one side and will bind the cells to tissues that are on another side. If we look at epithelial tissues, generally speaking, we can name them based on how many layers there are and the shape of the cells. And then finally, there's an in-betweening category known as transitional epithelium that's going to change its appearance in response to varying amounts of tension that are placed on it. So the naming system based on shape and layers doesn't apply to transitional epithelium. We call it the etc. category. So if there is one layer of cells, we call it simple. If there's multiple layers of cells, we call it stratified. And this strip right here on the bottom of the screen is a basement membrane that anchors this simple layer of cells to the underlying tissue types. Then there's pseudostratified. Pseudostratified looks like there's multiple layers, but really only has one layer of cells. Here's a good example of pseudostratified. Now we can also name the cells based on their shapes. If they are cubed or circular, generally speaking, we call them cuboidal. If they are oblong or columnar shaped, we call them columnar cells. And if they've been flattened, they are squamous. This looks like there's multiple layers, because we can see these little tiny guys down here on the bottom, but really has one layer. So we call this a pseudostratified, and because they are very oblong, we call this columnar. This would also be simple columnar, because these are longer or taller than they are wide. So these would be oblong or columnar. So we call this cell type a simple columnar. This is a pseudostratified columnar. And here are examples of other cell types. In our lungs, forming our alveoli, we have simple layers or single layers of flattened cells. We call this simple squamous. In our kidneys, we have single layers of cuboidal cells. We call that simple cuboidal. Within our intestinal tract, we have single layers of columnars. We call that simple columnar. Within our respiratory tract, we have pseudostratified ciliated columnar epithelium. And then, if we look on the surface of our bodies and also lining our esophagus and mouth, we have many layers of flattened cells. That is going to be stratified squamous cells because of the many layers of flattened cells. So, concept check class. Epithelial tissue forms barriers, membranes, glands, or all of the above. Go ahead and rewind the video to get me an answer, or you can pause it and check your textbook and or notes. 5, 4, 3, 2, 1. The correct answer is D, all of the above. Epithelial tissues form our surfaces or barriers in our bodies. Epithelial tissues are going to be forming membranes in our bodies. And it's also worth emphasizing that our epithelial tissues are going to form our glandular secretions, or our glands in our bodies. So epithelial tissues form barriers, membranes, and glands. All right, that's all we have for our tissue types for this recording. Our next half of this presentation is going to focus on the integumentary system, but that's going to be a different recording. If you have any questions for me about tissue types in the bodies, connective, epithelial, nervous, or muscular, please feel free to ask me in class, or you can shoot me an email or post them on the discussion board. Happy studies!